I was looking at the numbers before we started, and they are, frankly, absurd. We are talking about a band that has sold over 100 million albums. They've played in practically every stadium from Sheffield to San Francisco. When you think of them, you probably hear these massive, polished, anthemic choruses, the kind of stuff that is just designed to reach the back row of a football arena.
It's the soundtrack of the 80s for a lot of people. Big hair, big drums, big hooks.
Exactly. But here's the thing that jumped out at me while digging through the stack of research for today. If you peel back that glossy production, their history is defined almost as much by absolute catastrophe as it is by the hits.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, most bands break up because, like, the bassist sleeps with the drummer's girlfriend, or they argue over songwriting credits.
Right, or the musical trends just shift and they kind of fade away.
But this group, they are a case study in what I can only describe as extreme resilience. Today, we're doing a deep dive into Def Leppard. But the mission here isn't to just list their discography. We want to figure out how a group of working-class guys from Sheffield, England,
formed way back in 1977.
Yeah, how they managed to survive a series of events that would have destroyed, and I mean obliterated, any other band.
It's a heavy list. We're talking about amputation, death, severe addiction, cancer, and yet somehow they're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
And to set the tone, I found this quote from lead singer Joe Elliott during their 2019 Hall of Fame induction speech that I think just frames this entire conversation perfectly. He looked at the crowd and said, "If alcoholism, car crashes, and cancer couldn't kill us, the 90s had no expletive chance."
That is the perfect summary. And what stands out to me in the sources we have, which range from really technical breakdowns of their studio sessions to, these raw interviews with band members like Joe Elliott and Phil Collins, is the timing of these disasters. It's almost scripted. Every single time they reached a new peak, something devastating just knocked them right back down.
So let's unpack this timeline, because the pattern starts way earlier than I remembered. I always associate the tragedy era with the drummer, Rick Allen, losing his arm.
Sure.
But the chaos actually started during the recording of their breakthrough album, Pyromania.
That's right. This is 1982. They are in the studio, the pressure is on to deliver a hit, and they have a massive problem with their founding guitarist, Pete Willis.
And Pete wasn't just a hired gun, he was a founder. He helped start the band.
He was crucial. But by 1982, his drinking had become a massive liability. The sources describe an incident during the recording of the track Stage Fright where he was so intoxicated he literally couldn't play his parts.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was stumbling, making mistakes, holding up the entire very expensive production.
And the date of his firing is just, you can't make this up. It wasn't just random Tuesday?
No, it was July 11th, 1982, the day of the World Cup final. Italy versus West Germany. The whole world is watching soccer, emotions are high, and Joe Elliott has to make the call to fire one of his oldest friends.
And it wasn't management.
No, it wasn't management stepping in. The band had to do it themselves.
That's a brutal way to grow up. You're in your early 20s and you have to fire your friend for the sake of the business.
But look at the resilience immediately kicking in. They didn't mourn for months. They fired Pete on the 11th, and on July 12th, literally the next day, they hired Phil Collins.
Talk about a quick turnaround.
And Phil was the missing piece. He came in, finished the solos for Pyromania, and the album explodes. It sells millions. They are suddenly superstars. They are riding this incredible high, preparing to record the follow-up, which would become Hysteria, and then New Year's Eve, 1984.
The accident.
The pivotal moment. Drummer Rick Allen is driving his Corvette Stingray in the English countryside. He gets into a race with an Alfa Romeo, loses control, hits a stone wall, and is thrown from the vehicle.
And the seatbelt.
The seatbelt shears his left arm off completely.
Now, most people know this part of the story. Rick Allen, the Thunder God, loses his arm, but eventually continues to drum. It's rock and roll folklore. But in our research, I found a detail that I honestly had never heard before, and it blew my mind.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Everyone focuses on the missing left arm, but in that same crash, Rick Allen broke his right arm so severely that the doctors initially thought they were going to have to amputate that one too.
Wait, seriously? So he was facing the possibility of being a double amputee?
It was a very real possibility. He had severe tissue damage and infection in the right arm. He basically had to fight off septicemia just to keep the one arm he had left.
That changes the whole perspective. It's not just I lost an arm, it's I barely kept the other one.
Exactly. That's why if you look at Rick's artwork, he does visual art now, he often uses a handprint as a central theme. It's not just a design. It's a symbol of gratitude that he still has a right hand to hold a drumstick or a paintbrush.
The psychological toll there must have been unimaginable. The sources say that initially, Rick just wanted to disappear. He told the band, "I'm done. I'm a freak. Leave me alone."
And this is the moment that defines the band's character. They could have easily said, "We're really sorry, Rick. Here's a check. We're hiring a session drummer."
Of course, they had a multi-million-dollar career on the line.
But they didn't.
They waited.
They waited. They did not audition a single drummer. Joe Elliott and the guys basically sat by his hospital bed and said, "There is no band without you. We wait until you decide if you can do it."
And when he decided to try, it wasn't as simple as just, taping a stick to his arm. The technical adaptation required here is fascinating.
It's an engineering marvel. Rick worked with Simmons, an electronic drum manufacturer, to build a completely custom kit. The challenge was, how do you play a rhythm when you don't have a left hand to hit the snare drum? That's the backbeat of rock and roll.
Right. Usually it's right hand on the hi-hat, left hand on the snare. Boom, bap, boom, boom, bap.
Exactly. So they rigged the kit so that his left foot triggered the snare sound. He had to relearn his entire instrument. He had to rewire his brain to shift the primary rhythm keeping from his upper body to his left leg.
That's like asking a concert pianist to suddenly play the melody with their feet.
It is, and it took months of agonizing practice. But that limitation, the fact that he was using electronic triggers, completely changed the way Def Leppard sounded. It gave them that punchy, machine-like precision that became the backbone of Hysteria.
Which leads us perfectly into the making of Hysteria. If Pyromania was a hit, Hysteria was something else entirely. The goal for this album was insanely ambitious.
Ambitious is an understatement. Their producer, Robert John Mutt Lange, had a vision. He told the band, "I don't want to make a rock album. I want to make a hard rock version of Michael Jackson's Thriller."
And by that, he didn't mean he wanted them to dance like Michael Jackson.
No, he meant the crossover appeal. Every single track on Thriller was a hit single. There was no filler. Mutt Lange wanted Hysteria to be the same. 7 hit singles.
But getting there took over 3 years. And looking at the notes, it was a nightmare production. You had Rick's recovery, obviously. But then Joe Elliott got the mumps. Mutt Lange had his own car accident and leg injury. And before Mutt came back, they tried working with Jim Steinman.
The guy who wrote Bat Outta Hell for Meatloaf.
Right. And that went poorly.
It was a disaster. Steinman wanted a raw sound. He wanted to capture the band playing live in a room, mistakes and all. That is the opposite of the Def Leppard philosophy. They wanted absolute sonic perfection.
So they scrapped it.
They ended up scrapping almost everything they did with him and starting over.
This brings us to the tech deep dive portion of this story. Because when you listen to Hysteria, it doesn't sound like a normal band playing in a dive bar. It sounds like a spaceship. And there is a reason for that.
It's sonic architecture. They didn't record as a band, they recorded piece by piece. But here's the detail that always shocks people, especially guitar players. You picture an 80s rock band, you picture walls of Marshall stacks, right? Volume at 11.
Blowing the roof off the studio, yeah.
Nope. For Hysteria, they use a device called a Rockman.
A Rockman, like the little plastic box you plug headphones into.
That's the one. It was a headphone amp developed by Tom Stoltz from the band Boston. Their engineer, Mike Shipley, described it as a shitty little box with a god-awful sound if you just listen to it on its own.
Hold on. You're telling me Hysteria, one of the most expensive-sounding albums ever made, was recorded through a piece of plastic meant for practicing in a hotel room. Why on earth would Mutt Lange do that?
Because of the layering? Mutt didn't want the crunch and feedback of a real amp because that takes up too much sonic space. He wanted a clean, compressed, processed signal. That way he could layer the guitars 20, 30 times on top of each other to create these massive chords without it turning into mud.
So it was about precision.
Absolute precision. And the same goes for the drums. We mentioned Rick's electronic kit, but in the studio, they took it a step further. They were using a Fairlight CMI.
The Fairlight. That was basically a supercomputer back then, right?
It was. It was a sampler. They would sample drum sounds, sometimes a snare drum, sometimes just a sound effect, and program the rhythms into the computer. This allowed them to separate the drum frequencies perfectly so they wouldn't clash with the bass or the guitars.
And that was tedious work.
Oh, it was like coding. Programming a Fairlight in 1986 wasn't like dragging a file in GarageBand today.
So what does this all mean for the listener? It means Hysteria was essentially a pop record bit with rock instruments.
Precisely. It was manufactured perfection. And despite the 3 years of hell, the payoff was undeniable. Hysteria went 12 times platinum in the U.S. alone, and ironically, the biggest hit, Pour Some Sugar on Me, was the very last song written.
I love that story. Joe Elliott was just strumming it on an acoustic guitar during a break, right?
Yeah, Mutt heard him and said, "Stop, that's the hook." They recorded it in a few days. Contrast that with a song like Animal, which took them literally 3 years to finish. It just shows you never know where the hit is coming from.
So they conquer the world again. Hysteria is a monster. They are on top of the mountain. They survived the drummer losing an arm. Surely they've paid their dues.
You'd think so.
But the universe wasn't done with them.
No. And this next chapter is the darkest part of their history. This is the tragedy of Steve Clark.
Steve Clark, the riff master.
He was the creative soul of the band in many ways. While Phil Collen was the technical shredder, Steve was the guy with the swagger, the guy who wrote those cool hanging riffs. They called him and Phil the Terror Twins because they were inseparable.
But Steve was battling severe, crippling alcoholism.
Yeah.
The details in the sources are just heartbreaking. It wasn't just he liked to party. It was a physiological addiction. There's a note here about him being found in Minneapolis with a blood alcohol level of 0.59.
I want to pause on that number.
Yeah.
0.59. That is double the level that usually induces a coma. It is significantly higher than the level that killed John Bonham of Led Zeppelin.
Wow.
The fact that he was even conscious, let alone walking around, is medically baffling.
And the band knew he was in trouble. They tried everything, didn't they? Interventions, rehab.
They did. In late 1990, they finally gave him a 6-month leave of absence. The band's position was, "We love you, go get healthy, your spot is waiting for you, we aren't firing you." It was the same grace they showed Rick Allen.
But this time, the ending was different.
Sadly, yes. Steve Clark died on January 8, 1991. Respiratory failure caused by a mix of alcohol and prescription drugs. He was only 30 years old.
This is the moment where I feel like 99% of bands would fold. You've lost your main songwriter, your best friend, the guy who defined your sound. You've already been through the drummer's accident. How much can you take?
Their reaction to Steve's death was intense. It was almost military-grade compartmentalization. They went back to work the very next day after the funeral.
The next day.
The next day. Joe Elliott said they were terrified of splitting up. They saw what happened to Led Zeppelin after Bonham died. They just stopped. Def Leppard decided that the work was their therapy. They had to keep moving.
And this led to the album Adrenalized. But now they had a huge problem. They are a 2-guitar band with only one guitarist. And they didn't want to replace Steve immediately out of respect.
So Phil Collen had to become a superhero. He had to play all the guitars on the album. But remember, the Def Leppard sound is built on 2 distinct guitar styles playing off each other. So Phil couldn't just play his parts, he had to play Steve's parts too.
That sounds exhausting just thinking about it.
It was worse than that. Phil was so obsessed with getting the texture right that he recorded the parts 3 separate times. He recorded once in a studio in Holland and then twice in Dublin using different setups just to create the illusion that there were 2 different people playing.
He was essentially playing a ghost's role as well as his own.
That's it. That is dedication. And
Yeah.
they did pay tribute to Steve on the album with the song White Lightning.
Which is a very powerful, very heavy track.
It is. It's about Steve, but it's also about Hendrix and Janis Joplin, this idea of the white lightning, the addiction, the personal hell that you can't escape. It's one of the few times they dropped the party band guard and got real about the pain they were in.
Yet, despite the grief, despite the ghost of Steve Clark hanging over the sessions, Adrenalize hits #1 globally in 1992. Let's Get Rocked is everywhere. They eventually hire Vivian Campbell, who had played with Dio and Whitesnake, to join them for the tour. They've survived again.
But the cruel irony is, just as Adrenalize lands, the culture shifts underneath their feet.
We're talking about the 90s, or more specifically, Seattle.
Grunge, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden. Overnight, the musical landscape changed. Suddenly, that polished, layered rockman sound that Def Leppard spent 5 years perfecting, it was considered the enemy. It was fake.
Hair metal became a dirty word. So we have these guys who just poured their hearts into a perfect production, and suddenly the world wants guys in flannel shirts playing sloppy chords on pawn shop guitars. How did they react? Did they try to pivot and wear flannel?
Thankfully, no, but they did adapt, and this is another example of their resilience. They didn't try to be Nirvana, but they realized they couldn't make Hysteria Part 3. So in 1996, they released an album called Slang.
And looking at the notes on slang, it seems like a total departure.
It was. They rented a villa in Marbella, Spain, and for the first time in over a decade, they played together in a room, face to face.
And Rick Allen went back to acoustic drums.
That's the huge shift. He ditched the electronic samples. It was a darker, grittier, organic record. It didn't sell like Hysteria. I mean, nothing could, but it proved they weren't just a nostalgia act. They were willing to evolve to stay alive.
Fast forward a bit further. The band has stabilized. They weathered the grunge storm. They are touring monsters again. And then, in 2013, another health crisis. Vivian Campbell, the new guy, who had been with him for 20 years by then, gets a diagnosis.
Hodgkin's lymphoma. And Vivian's approach to this mirrors the band's history perfectly. He treated it like a job he had to do. He went through chemotherapy, a stem cell transplant, and eventually immunotherapy.
There's a quote from him where he calls the cancer battle whack-a-mole. You beat it down, it pops up somewhere else.
But remarkably, as of May 2025, Vivian is still touring. There are moments where he was doing treatment in the morning and getting on a plane to play a show at night. He refused to stay home.
It just reinforces that core identity of the band.
Yeah.
The show goes on no matter what.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the ultimate validation of this struggle. The 2019 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction.
This was a beautiful full-circle moment. They were inducted by Brian May of Queen, and you have to remember, Queen was their absolute idol. Def Leppard modeled their harmonies and their ambition on Queen. So having Brian May welcome them into the club was huge.
And during the speeches, Joe Elliott made a point to acknowledge the family aspect of the band.
That's key. Rick Savage, the bass player, is the only other original member from the very start besides Joe. But the bond holding the current lineup together is forged in all this trauma. Joe Elliott has this philosophy he calls mind over matter.
Mind over matter. It sounds like a cliche bumper sticker, but when you look at their history, amputations, deaths, changing eras, it's practically a survival strategy.
It is. Joe talks about how their ability to separate the tragedy from the job is what saved them. When their personal lives were falling apart, Steve dying, Rick losing his arm, they went into the studio and created euphoric, celebratory music.
That is the paradox, isn't it? The darker their reality got, the brighter and bigger the music became.
Exactly. Adrenalize, their biggest success after Hysteria, came immediately following their biggest loss. It proves that their music wasn't just a product. It was their coping mechanism.
Right.
It was escapism for them just as much as it was for the fans.
They needed those big, happy choruses to drown out the sorrow.
That's it. So Def Leppard isn't just a band with catchy hooks. They are a study in survival. They adapted technology, electronic drums, studio layering, and they adapted emotionally to keep the machine moving.
And they represent a work ethic that is, I think, almost vanished from rock music. They spent years perfecting single albums to ensure every song was a hit. They didn't settle.
They absolutely did not.
Which raises an important question for you listening today. Def Leppard famously spent 3-4 years perfecting a single album like Hysteria or Adrenalizing. In today's streaming economy of constant content churn, where artists are expected to drop a new track every week to stay relevant, could a band like Def Leppard even exist? Or was their perfectionism and the resilience it required a product of a bygone era?
It's something to think about. I'm not sure we'll see that level of studio dedication again.
Thanks for diving in with us. We'll catch you on the next one.